I remember the morning of my son Michael's wedding like it was yesterday. I'm Evelyn Harper, 62, a widow for nearly a decade, and most people think my life has been quiet and modest. That day, I wanted nothing more than to sit at the edge of the celebration, smile politely, and feel proud of my son without drawing any attention to myself. But as soon as I arrived at the Miller estate, a grand place nestled on rolling hills in Virginia, everything I thought I controlled felt fragile. Lauren, my new daughter-in-law, walked past me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There was something in the way she glanced at my navy dress, my grandmother's pearls, that made it clear she already had me sized up and dismissed. For a moment, I felt the sting of being invisible again, the old ache of being underestimated. I wondered if Michael noticed, if anyone would see the quiet tension hovering between us. I held my head high and reminded myself why I had always chosen discretion. People think they know the story of my life, but most have no idea what I've built behind closed doors. And yet, even I hadn't expected the cascade of events that would unfold that evening. Lauren's whispered assumptions and the polite smiles around the room were just the surface. Beneath it, something was about to change, and I could feel the pulse of it as sharply as if it were the beat of the music in the reception hall. I've always believed that life tests you in moments when the world expects you to stay quiet, to blend in, to let others take the spotlight. That day, I realized the lesson wasn't about blending in anymore. Sometimes, the world gives you a stage without your asking, and sometimes, that stage reveals not only the truth of who you are, but also the people who never knew you at all. Even as I smiled and moved through the crowd, I couldn't shake the thought of what might happen if my real life were uncovered tonight. Would anyone believe it? Would my son see me differently? Or would it shatter the careful image I had maintained for years? And in that moment, standing quietly near the edge of the room, I promised myself to pay attention, to observe, to remember, and to prepare for what was coming next. By the time the first dance started, I knew this evening was going to be unlike any other, and I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if someone finally saw the woman I really was? The reception hall was breathtaking, sparkling with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with white roses. Guests laughed and clinked glasses, moving through the room with a confidence I had long since learned to observe rather than join. My son Michael looked radiant, completely absorbed in the moment, yet I noticed how he barely glanced my way. That tiny absence made my chest tighten. I realized then how easily a mother can feel invisible, even at her own child's wedding. Lauren moved among the guests with the kind of practiced charm that demanded attention. I could feel her evaluating me, her polite smiles carrying an undercurrent of judgment. Every gesture, every glance she threw my way felt like a reminder that she had already placed me in a box, quiet, unimportant, harmless. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay composed, and to watch carefully. I've learned that patience reveals far more than confrontation ever could. As I sipped my champagne, I reflected on the unspoken dynamics at play. The wedding wasn't just about celebrating a union. It was a subtle battlefield of perception, influence, and social standing. Michael, caught between his bride and his mother, seemed unaware of the tension radiating from Lauren, though I could see the flicker of concern in his eyes when he glanced at me. I wanted to reassure him, to let him know that I was present in my own way, even if the world seemed blind to it. The air was thick with expectations, but I had always been a student of human behavior. I could feel the weight of every conversation around me, the polite laughter, the small nods of acknowledgement that often mask scrutiny. Watching Lauren, I realized how carefully she curated her image, how she measured each interaction to secure her place in the family hierarchy. And in that moment, I understood the challenge this evening would reveal not just social grace, but character, patience, and the quiet strength that I had cultivated for years. Even in this glittering setting, my own modest attire and composed demeanor were deliberate. I was blending in, yes, but I was also observing, listening, and preparing. There was power in silence, and tonight that power would be tested. As the music swelled and the first dance drew everyone's attention, I felt the first ripple of anticipation. Something was about to shift, and I could sense it in the slight tension in Lauren's smile, in the way guests subtly turned their heads. It was the calm before the first storm, and I was ready to see who truly understood what mattered. The night was only beginning, and already I felt the quiet pulse of change. I reminded myself to stay present, to notice every glance, every movement, because sometimes the smallest observations become the greatest revelations. And I had a feeling tonight would bring a revelation unlike any other. As I stood there, quietly observing the celebration, my mind drifted back over the years to the life I had deliberately hidden from the world. Most people assumed I lived modestly on a widow's pension, that my apartment and 10-year-old sedan reflected all I had. They didn't know that the quiet, careful life they saw was part of a strategy, a shield I had built to live without scrutiny, to move freely, to protect my son's independence. I thought about my late husband, Robert. We met in our 20s, two young engineers with dreams bigger than our bank accounts. Together, we had a knack for spotting opportunities that others overlooked. I remember the day our first major patent sale came through. A check for $25 million that made the world feel surreal. We never flaunted it, never let Michael know the scale, because we wanted him to carve his own path, to grow into a man whose success came from his own effort rather than inheritance. Over the years, we invested wisely, cautiously at first, then more boldly, learning each lesson the market offered. When Robert passed suddenly in his early 60s, I was left with grief and a portfolio that had quietly grown to over $700 million. I kept living simply because it was easier to blend in, to let the world underestimate me. I didn't want accolades or envy, only freedom. I had learned long ago that the trappings of wealth often draw more problems than happiness. Even in this room, surrounded by opulence, I felt the familiar calm of invisibility. My navy dress, my grandmother's pearls. They were not just fashion choices, they were armor. I reminded myself that patience and observation were my allies. The people around me would never guess the truth unless I chose to reveal it. And yet, as I watched Lauren move through the crowd with that practiced charm, I realized that this evening might be the moment where my secret could no longer stay hidden. She had approached me politely in the weeks leading up to the wedding, asking questions about finances, subtly probing, under the guise of curiosity. At the time, I had dismissed it as politeness. Now, I sensed it for what it really was, ambition wrapped in a smile. A plan carefully laid without my knowledge. I reflected on the irony of it all. My life, so quietly extraordinary, had been invisible to those who mattered least, while those who judged me most were oblivious to the depth of my choices. I felt a quiet pride, a patient satisfaction. I knew that every observation, every calculation, every moment I had spent building this foundation in silence had led to this point. And in that awareness, A small smile tugged at my lips. The music swelled, the dance floor shimmered, and I realized that the first shift of the evening was approaching. I could feel it in the air, in the subtle tension around me. Something was about to change, and I was ready to step into the moment with all the calm and clarity that only years of experience and careful planning could bring. Tonight, I thought, would be the night the world discovered that the quiet widow in the corner was far more than anyone imagined. And with that thought, I allowed myself a breath, steadying for the revelation that was coming. The moment came unexpectedly, just as the soft hum of conversation filled the ballroom. Lauren's father, Charles Miller, turned his gaze toward me with a spark of recognition that I had not anticipated. I could feel the room pause for an instant, though no one admitted it. In that quiet, I sensed a shift, a subtle tension that whispered of revelation. He had seen through the carefully maintained facade that I had worn for 15 years. And suddenly, the illusion of modesty began to unravel. In that moment, I remembered every decision I had made to remain invisible, the simple apartment, the unassuming wardrobe, the everyday routines that concealed decades of planning and achievement. No one had ever guessed that I had quietly built a fortune, that every choice was a step toward security and independence. And now, in one glance, Charles had recognized the truth. I watched Lauren's face pale slightly, her carefully composed mask faltering. It was fascinating to witness the realization settle in. How quickly assumptions crumble when confronted with undeniable truth. I reflected on the irony she had approached me with curiosity, probing about finances, imagining that she understood the limits of my life. She had no idea that the foundation of her new family, the world she thought she had entered, was already intertwined with my actions, my investments, my decisions. I felt a quiet surge of control. I did not need to speak. The recognition in Charles's eyes, the tension in Lauren's posture, conveyed everything. The power of observation, patience, and silent diligence became palpable in that room. For so long, I had blended into the background, allowing others to measure me by the standards they imposed. Tonight, the rules had shifted, though subtly, without a single word uttered. The awareness of my hidden life brought not only satisfaction, but also a profound responsibility. I needed to navigate this revelation carefully, protecting my son while asserting the quiet authority I had cultivated. I reflected on the lessons of my past. Wealth alone is meaningless without wisdom, discretion, and timing. And timing, as it happened, was now on my side. As I allowed the tension to linger, I thought about the ripple effects. Every glance in that room, every whispered assumption, had been recalibrated by this single recognition. It reminded me of the power of living deliberately, of mastering the art of observation and patience. Even the smallest gestures, the choices to appear unremarkable, had set the stage for this moment, this subtle reversal of expectations. In that pause, I understood something crucial. The evening would not continue as any of them anticipated. I was no longer merely a quiet presence at the wedding. I had become a force shaped by years of careful decisions and unwavering self-respect. And with that understanding, I felt a calm resolve, a readiness to meet whatever came next with clarity, composure, and the quiet strength that had defined my life. As the music swelled again and the first dance drew attention away from the corners of the room, I reminded myself to stay alert. The night was far from over, and the true unfolding of events The lessons and revelations that would come were only beginning. I took a steady breath and prepared for the next shift in this delicate dance, a confrontation that would test more than patience, but the very foundation of trust and respect within my family. After that moment of recognition, I could sense Lauren's carefully constructed confidence beginning to crack. She had always moved through life with precision, expecting others to follow the path she imagined. But I had spent years building patience, observation, and strategy into my life. And now, those skills were coming into play. I realized that this wasn't just about being acknowledged, it was about protecting my son, my family, and the integrity of the life I had worked so quietly to preserve. I reflected on how Lauren had approached me over the past weeks, asking questions that seemed casual, almost polite, but now revealed themselves as probing maneuvers. I understood her curiosity for what it really was, an attempt to access what she assumed she could never have. And I felt the familiar calm of knowing that while she prepared her next move, I already had mine mapped out. Every action she took had to be met not with emotion, but with clarity and foresight. As the evening continued, I allowed myself to observe closely. I noticed the subtle hesitations in her gestures, the way she carefully measured her words when she spoke to Michael, and the glances she cast toward me, perhaps wondering how much I truly knew. I thought about the years of decisions, the investments, the meticulous management of a portfolio that had grown quietly into nearly $1 billion. It wasn't wealth that defined me, it was the discipline, the foresight, and the patience that came with it. I reflected on the power of silence. Rather than confront her outright, I let the awareness of my capabilities settle around her like an invisible weight. She needed to understand, without me saying a word, that underestimating me was a miscalculation. I thought about how often people assume weakness when they see simplicity, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that tonight, the illusion would be shattered on its own. Even as I held my composure, my mind calculated the path forward. If Lauren wanted to manipulate or control, she would find that she was several moves behind a life carefully structured over decades. I remembered lessons learned from my late husband. The most powerful position is the one in which patience, preparation, and calm observation are combined. And now, in this room filled with celebration, I could see those principles in action, quietly, but unmistakably. By the end of the reception, it was clear that the first challenge had passed in my favor. Lauren would continue to test, to probe, but I had already set the terms without confrontation. The quiet strength I had honed for years remained intact, and my son, though unaware of the full extent, would witness the integrity that underpinned our family. The night was far from over, but I felt a deep, steady confidence. I had met the first wave of tension not with anger, but with the patient clarity that comes from knowing who you are and what you've built. And as the room began to clear, I prepared for the next steps, aware that the evening had only revealed the surface of what would come, and that the true resolution was still ahead. After the initial tension settled, I watched as the dynamics in the room began to shift. Lauren's confident posture softened, and though she tried to maintain her composure, I could see her weighing her next steps carefully. I knew then that the game she had attempted to play would no longer dictate our family's future. My role was no longer simply to observe, it was to ensure clarity, respect, and the protection of my son's independence. I reflected on Michael's position in all of this. He had always believed in building his life on his own merit, unaware of the foundation quietly laid beneath his feet. His admiration for Lauren's ambition had blinded him, but the night had subtly opened a window into the truth. I felt a mixture of pride and empathy, understanding the conflict he must be feeling. I reminded myself that this was a learning moment for him, as much as it was a revelation for everyone else. As the evening drew to a close, I thought about the years of patience, observation, and careful decision-making that had brought me to this point. The fortune I had managed was never about the numbers, it was about freedom, foresight, and resilience. Lauren's attempts to manipulate or control could not overshadow the values I had cultivated, the legacy I had built. I allowed myself a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that true power often manifests in stillness and clarity rather than confrontation. In the following days, the family began to adjust to the new reality. Michael processed the truth slowly, grappling with the understanding that his mother had not only protected him, but also created an environment in which he could grow without dependence. His respect deepened, and our conversations became more open, more genuine. I realized that this reconciliation was not about erasing past misunderstandings, but about forging a bond grounded in trust, honesty, and shared values. I also reflected on the importance of boundaries. True respect comes from recognizing limits and understanding intentions. By standing firm with calm authority, I had not only preserved my own dignity, but also ensured that my son could navigate his relationships with clarity and confidence. It was a lesson in patience, strategy, and the quiet assertion of self-worth principles that I hoped he would carry with him throughout his life. As I thought about the future, I felt a sense of peace. The confrontation had passed, lessons had been learned, and the foundations of trust and integrity had been reinforced. I knew that life would continue to present challenges, but I also knew that with patience, observation, and quiet strength, those challenges could be met with confidence and grace. And in that realization, I found a deep, enduring satisfaction that went far beyond any fortune or social recognition. The night had revealed much, but the true reward was far more profound: the ability to live authentically, to guide with wisdom, and to leave a legacy built not on wealth alone, but on resilience, integrity, and love. As the weeks passed, I found myself reflecting on what truly mattered. The confrontation with Lauren and the revelations at the wedding were behind us, yet the lessons lingered. I realized that the wealth I had quietly built was never the most important part of my life. The real value lay in the choices I had made, the discipline I had maintained, and the integrity I had preserved for myself and my family. I thought about Michael, how he had begun to understand that independence and resilience were gifts far greater than money. Watching him navigate his own path with renewed respect for the foundation beneath him brought me a quiet sense of fulfillment. It reminded me that our legacy is measured not by accounts or possessions, but by the principles we pass on and the examples we set. Moving forward, I chose to embrace life fully, not in secrecy, but with authenticity. I poured energy into things that brought genuine joy and purpose, like supporting young engineers through scholarships, honoring my late husband's memory, and living each day with a sense of presence rather than pretense. I realized that true empowerment comes from living aligned with your values and from nurturing relationships built on trust, not appearances. As I reflect now, I recognize how easy it is to let others define our worth, especially within family dynamics. Yet, the most meaningful victories are often quiet, unseen, and deeply personal. I learned that patience, observation, and calm confidence can protect both our hearts and our families more effectively than confrontation ever could. If there's one thing I hope anyone listening takes from my story, it's this: never underestimate the power of resilience, discretion, and integrity. Stand firm in your values, protect your peace, and trust that your quiet strength will reveal itself at the right moment. Life will present challenges, misjudgments, and misunderstandings, but facing them with grace allows you to thrive, not just survive. And if my story resonates with you, I invite you to share your experiences, reflect on the lessons you've learned in your own family dynamics, and consider how patience, observation, and quiet strength can guide your own journey. Like, share, or comment. Let's keep the conversation going, because sometimes the most valuable insights come from the stories we exchange.